As opticians, we've been fitting progressive lenses for over 50 years. You'd think by now we'd have figured out the non-adapt problem, but it's bigger than ever. Today we're going to talk about some of the issues you should probably be considering when you're fitting and troubleshooting progressive lenses. Today's progressive lens technology is so much more advanced than it was when progressives first came out in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's incredible how much mathematical accuracy goes into a lens design. One of the pitfalls, however, is that you don't know much about the mathematical stuff that's going on behind the scenes. So back in the day, this many moons ago, a progressive lens would be a fixed design. So it would be molded into the lens. So that lens, wherever you put it, that lens design is exactly the same. Today's progressives factor in a whole lot of variables, and the design, the same exact design, can come out a million different ways based on frame parameters and prescription and position aware parameters. And it's important to be aware of a couple of the challenges that might present when you're troubleshooting progressive lenses.
Can I trust the software when designing progressive lenses?
While today's progressive lenses are much, much better and consider so many more variables than your older designs, it is important to recognize that basically you're putting a bunch of parameters into a black box and it's spitting a lens design out. They tell you how you can check their lens design. That's kind of like when you ask a politician if they care about you, because they'll tell you exactly what you want to hear.
Read my lips.
So with progressive lens designs, with the fact that you are throwing all this data into a black box, it is important to be aware of how important that data is. So the one instance that I've come back to a couple times is if you put the data in for the frame with box dimensions versus the actual trace, you're going to get a completely different lens design. If you put in your face form or your pantoscopic tilt or your vertex distance different, or you put in a default value where maybe it shouldn't be, you're going to get a completely different lens design, because that's all you're plugging in. So you're plugging in the position aware parameters, you're plugging in the prescription, you're plugging in all that data into a black box that's then spitting out a design using that data. So it is important to recognize how it uses that data, when it uses that data, and how that's going to affect the final glasses that you are ultimately, that your patient is holding you responsible for.
When ordering progressives, why do we need the trace information available?
One of the most critical elements is that when you are ordering a progressive, that you have the trace information available. And let me give you a quick example of how that can go wrong. So if you're making, so traditionally when we order, when we do a frame, we use box measurements, right? So you go your AB and your ED. And those measurements are used when we're measuring a fitting height. So now let's take a lens that's like an aviator shape. And say the patient's PD is somewhat narrow and it sits about here in the lens. So you could have a fitting height that is, say, 28 millimeters. This is not to scale, this is just examples. And if you just provide a box measurement to the lab, what's going to happen is they are going to pretend that lens is the shape of a box and put the reading area probably somewhere around here. Now you can see when we finally manufacture the glasses, we're going to cut that, and the patient will lose the reading area about halfway through. So that's why it's important to provide a trace, because then the freeform software will calculate utilizing the trace and make a progressive design that's more aligned with the actual frame measurements rather than the box measurements that you provide.
Can you explain corridor length versus fitting height?
Today's freeform progressive lens designs have oftentimes variable corridor length. So if you go back in the day and you ordered, say, a specific brand of progressive, that brand of progressive would have what's known as a minimum fitting height. And that minimum fitting height would be how you would decide what progressive to use given a certain frame. Now, with variable fitting heights, or variable corridor length, you provide the fitting height and the trace, and the software for the freeform calculations will establish the corridor length. So for this case, you might say, hey, the fitting height is 28, but it will say, hey, you know what? Based on the frame that I have, the design that I'm using is only going to be a 14 millimeter corridor. So the freeform software decides all this, but it is important to realize that if you order the lens with the box measurements versus you order the lens with the trace, you're going to get a completely different lens, even if it's called the same name, even if the compensation values are the same. So that's one pitfall with digital progressives, is you need to be a lot more aware of what you're ordering, because there's so much variability and calculations going behind the scenes that you're not necessarily privy to.
How should I approach ordering progressives for large frames?
Another thing regarding design, corridor length, and fitting height is considering very, very large frames and how the patient's eyes will interact with that frame. So if we look at this person, they would have a very high fitting height in their progressive, and what happens is the bottom of the lens is largely sitting on their cheek. So if we do a fitting height and a corridor length that is aligned with the very bottom of the frame and where the eye goes, what's going to happen is there's going to be a part of the lens that's so close to the cheek that the patient can't actually reach that part of the lens. So that's one consideration with vertex distance and fitting height, is you want to make sure that you're not making the patient absolutely crane their neck or space the glasses out from their face to actually use their reading area. So that's another concern with the corridor length and fitting height that you'll want to be cognizant of.
How can prescription differences be magnified by progressive lenses?
When you have two different lenses that have a significant refractive error between them, what happens is as you move down the lens, as your eye moves down the lens, they track at different rates. So let's say this is lens 1, and this is lens 2, and lens 2 doesn't do much, and lens 1 is very strong. What's going to happen is as you move further down this lens, it's going to create prism in the opposite direction. And as you move down this lens, it's going to create much, much less prism. So while here you have a single image, here you have a prismatic imbalance. Now, what happens with slab off, and I'm going to erase this and create a new image because this one's a little bit hard to work with. What we do is, and it's kind of easier to show on a minus lens, so that's why I'm doing it. So we have this area, which is your optical center, and then here, where the image would go way down, what we do is by removing base down prism, so we would cut this section out of the lens. By removing base down prism, we create base up prism. So now this ray, which used to go way down here, we can now correct so that it goes to the same place in both lenses. So another name for this, which kind of really tells you exactly what it does, is called a bicentric grind. So the name bi is 2. So what you're essentially doing with a slab off is you're creating a lens that has 2 optical centers. So bicentric. So here's center 1 and here's center 2. and each of those centers is aligned with the other lens in the same spot. So essentially what you're doing is you're balancing that problem where the lens tracks differently. Now, it doesn't completely solve it because this lens, essentially all the spots between 1 and 2, it's tracking differently. But instead of a lens just having one sweet spot and you needing to try to find it, now this lens has 2 sweet spots, one for distance and one for reading.
How does vertex distance affect the efficiency of progressive lenses?
One thing that can have a dramatic effect on the efficacy or the perception of a progressive is the vertex distance. And if you want an example of how vertex distance works, if I put my fingers about a centimeter apart and look at the camera, I can see the whole camera and then some, and then I can see my whole marketing team cheering me on here. But then if I go further out, now I can just see the camera lens. So what happens is as the distance increases, the field of view decreases, and the distance never changed, right? So it's still a centimeter between my fingers, but what I can see in that centimeter has changed significantly as I move it further out. So the way that that works in progressive lenses is a lens is designed with this corridor. And the corridor is this area that is your power. So this area is kind of like a no man's zone. This is a swimmy area. So if you look in this area is kind of wavy and not really useful. This area is the progressive corridor. Now, if I bring the progressive corridor closer to the eye, it acts wider. So one of the things that we can do with our glasses is if we tip them forward this way and bring them in closer to the face, the effective width of this corridor seems wider. Now, the potential downside to that is that if you look at it from the side, now it used to be, so let's say that this right here is our add power. If I want to look through the add power, the angle increases. Let's use this same plane. And now if this add is here, now you need less of an angle to get to it. So essentially, if you tip the glasses forward, the corridor effectively widens, but also lengthens. So you would need to tip your head up more to see through it. So this is called pantoscopic tilt when you increase the tilt, and it's called retroscopic tilt when you tilt it back out. But you can use one or the other depending on the complaint. So if the patient says, hey, it feels like I have to really drop, I really have to go like this to get to my reading area, you could potentially add retroscopic tilt and effectively make the reading area less of a eye movement to get there. Now, if they're saying, hey, it's too swimmy, if you bring it in closer, that effectively widens it. So that's the use of pantoscopic and retroscopic tilt with progressives and really any bifocal.
What happens if you change a patient's progressive lens design?
One thing that we humans are is creatures of habit. And one of the things that freeform exposes with all of its variability and all of the customized designs per frame is that you can have the same patient in the same brand of progressives in 2 different frames and have them, when they put on the glasses, have a unique experience from one lens to the other. And that's just within the same brand, just maybe a different frame with a different shape or a different depth that changes the wear experience. Now, that's just within the same brand. Now, when you switch brands, you're opening another can of worms, potentially, where you have kind of competing physicists. And one physicist believes that the reason for swim in a progressive, or that the reason people are uncomfortable with progressives, is because of the corridor width, and another physicist says that, well, no, that's not it. It's because of the magnification when you go down the corridor. So if you switch a patient from one physicist's theory to another physicist's theory without telling the patient, and just do it because somebody told you that this is the latest and greatest progressive design, you're going to be disappointed. Because Patients are creatures of habit, and if you throw them in a completely different lens design without them being aware of it, that's going to be your problem.